Hi, my name is Jesse Valentine Ports, and this is Architecture and Design with Valentine. I think one of the next ways we could move forward, this will be dependent a lot on robotics and the ability to have software tools for architects that would be able to control all of these disparate pieces. Right now, building information modeling has been in development since the 80s, but it's a slow progress. A building is an incredibly complex assemblage of components. Now, with a building constructed on site, you have trained professionals who are skilled in plumbing, electrical, mechanical engineering, and typically you would have engineers on that front as well. This is kind of a different methodology for the whole building industry, so all of the professionals would have to get together in advance and make sure all of this stuff is perfectly figured out in advance and everything is really double checked. And one of the problems with often building on site is there is something that has not been figured out properly that the builder later finds out. This would sort of shift more responsibility onto designers to make sure that their designs were absolutely correct in advance, and there would have to be a much more careful and thorough process of making sure it's all right before it even goes through the beginning stages of construction.
That's fascinating because that suggests to me a lot of shifting in terms of communication skills and
It's true.
interpersonal dynamics and the ability to abilities for a different kind of teamwork.
Yeah, it's absolutely. The team would have to be. Teams are already pretty cohesive, but instead of, oftentimes what it'll be these days is the architect designs the initial concepts with the client, and then we'll bring in the engineers later on once we've done a lot of our work, and they'll fit it in. In this case, and we're moving towards this in green architecture too, because one of the aspects of green architecture and sustainable architecture is that we have to bring all the consultants in at the beginning and make sure it's all designed as a team, because in that regard we are much more capable of building something that meets all these a wide variety of needs that you get in architecture. Because beforehand, it used to be the architect had the drawings, then he gave it to the structural engineer, and the structural engineer made sure it stood up, and then you'd bring in the mechanical engineer and the electrical engineer and the plumbing engineer and make sure all of that fit into what had been designed by the architect and the structural engineer.
Which was way back in time already.
But it's still a way a lot of buildings get built today, but it is the old way of building, for sure.
Yeah, and that sounds like a silo kind of description of project management.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And instead, you're talking about not silo, but more integrated.
Yeah, it would have to be completely integrated. I think buildings should really be thought of less as objects, or as Le Corbusier, a machine for living, said. And instead of being a machine for living, it should really be more like a symbiotic living host.
Break that up for me. So a symbiotic living host.
Yeah, like a biological system,
Yeah.
where you would study inputs and outputs between whether it's water, electricity, air, oxygen, plus the outputs of all the systems, whether CO2 from the occupants or your pets, or, the list kind of can go on and on. Sewage reclamation, gray water reclamation, processing the water to clean it. It's really more thinking of it as an entire being in an environment,
The system.
as opposed to just something that doesn't have to worry about the environment it occupies.
Right. And these sorts of shifts have been in development for some time.
Absolutely. The green building movement has really kind of hit its stride in the past 10 years or so. But it has been around since the early 70s. However, it was largely ignored.
Why is that?
I think architecture and building industry is one of the slowest industries to change out of any of them. It takes a long time to be apprenticed into the industry. There's a huge amount of regulation covering it, so regulation is not easy to change. You know, we have public health regulations that govern clean water and sewage. We have zoning regulations that influence how occupancies are laid out in all places. We have other regulations on, you know, just what is an acceptable building material versus in general code.
One of the things I hear about in neighborhood projects is the length of time and the bureaucracy involved in getting permits.
It's a huge issue.
How does that relate here?
It would relate here in that, well, I think there still is an important factor in involving the community. That's one of the difficult things, but it's a challenge, but it's also, you know, an opportunity, if you want to look at it that way, to make buildings that would be much more interesting for the entire community and possibly much more beneficial on an ecological scale to the entire community.
I see.
The important thing is to try and educate people as much as possible as to the potential, so they're not just thinking this is going to be another eyesore that isn't going to benefit me at all.
Right, or not in my backyard, or
Exactly.
that design doesn't fit in with this neighborhood.
Right.
Those are some of the...
And so, yeah, part of the problem, I think, would be the entitlement to think that I get to control how my neighborhood looks.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that for sure. And, you know, I think it would be important to try and get buy-in from people to do interesting building, you know. There is always going to be friction, though, in a public process. But the really important thing for leaders to understand, and especially politicians, is how much do they value freedom over cohesive appearance.
Right, right, and that's really part of the public, what was that called? The public square, the commons, the public discourse. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
If it's working, quote, right, everybody has a voice at the table, but...
Right, but also part of the way America was founded on was the ability to have a fair amount of liberty in terms of how we decided to live our lives, which I think can directly apply to the kind of buildings we live in. And, you know, I think on the flip side of that is the buildings we have now are in some ways very ineffective at taking care of the commons, because there's a huge amount of rainwater runoff. There's no processing of water on site frequently. So we all ship everything to a sewage treatment plant and expect the government to take care of it, and we have to pay taxes for that.
Oh, you just connected that dot for me, because I was wondering, how does that, what kind of impact does that have on the user of the building? And you're pointing out that the users wind up paying more.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just like we, if we're not producing all of our electricity on site and are not off the grid, we're paying a huge amount into the grid for the electricity. Plus, we also pay with our health for air pollution.
Yes. And
we also pay with having water pollution from all the coal that's being burned.
Yes. Right. I mean, we've heard of spots around the country where community members insist that something in the ground, in the land, or from buildings is making them ill. That's the sort of thing you're talking about.
Right, and so that's a hidden cost that most people don't think of.
So I've never thought of this before, but clearly there's architecture and planning and design. It's not simply about aesthetics and and design and ideas of that sort, but there's a huge educational component.
Yeah.
More than a component, really, a huge educational
Right. There really has to be,
aspect.
because most people don't really have the deep understanding of both the construction process, how it impacts the environment, and how deep ecology could impact the environment in a beneficial way through architecture and building.
You just used the phrase deep ecology. Will you
Yeah.
say more about that?
Deep ecology is, there are lots of different ways to describe it, I suppose, but it's ecology that tries to look at the whole picture. It doesn't just say humans. Some people would say, humans aren't involved in the environment because we take care of all of our stuff, but that's ignoring a huge amount of what's actually, all the molecules that surround us. So we're trying to look at the whole systems both on in deep ecology you look at ecosystems on small scales up to larger scales and how they all interact and interplay.
But let's say that I'm just a plain, you know, layperson in my community, and I've been fortunate to purchase a small plot of land, maybe out in the desert in California,
Yeah.
and I want to I want someone to build me with the fixed amount of money I have, let's say, to build a nice home that I and about maybe 10 other friends could move to, like a little compound.
Absolutely.
But we have a limited, absolute finite amount of money. This sounds, what you're describing to me sounds like it could be really expensive.
It could be. It doesn't have to be, but it could be really expensive. And I think one of the issues is kind of structural in our society because the money system we're using doesn't incorporate all those extra costs that I described in terms of pollution and healthcare. And, that looking at the larger systems, it's too much looking at instead of having a holistic view, it's a dualistic bifurcated view where you're always looking at little symptoms and trying to fix the symptoms.
Right. And
so it is difficult to start over in that way, and basically it just takes time. Since if you don't have the 3D printer to start off with, then you are going to have to be doing probably a slower method.
That's right. You've taken us right back to the beginning of the 3D printer that I fell in love with. That's right. So my friends and I would be out in the desert with you and your firm, and we'd be seeing some of the walls of our compound coming out of this huge printer.
Potentially, yeah. And if I did it well enough, maybe you wouldn't even notice. Maybe it just looked like the desert.
Wow. You're a designer. Right. I'm picturing walls like this and this. That sounds pretty boring. Right. So you would talk with us about the context that's around us, and maybe we want it to look more like the surroundings. Yeah,
Absolutely.
sure.
Well, this has been a great chat. I'm looking forward to our next one.
Oh, I do too. You know that I'm
Yeah,
a newcomer to the field.
absolutely. Well,
Thanks
for being with
Valentine.
us. And thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you next time. Until then, I'm Jesse Valentine Ports, architect. Thank you, and bye-bye.